everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. Welcome to session 3, Physical and Ideological Connections, as Claudia said. In case you weren't here for the opening, my name is Dr. Jessica White. I'm a research fellow on the Terrorism and Conflict team here at RUSI. And this session sort of intends to carry on the conversation from the last session to discuss some of the ideological connections and sort of physical offline interactions that often ground the formation of transnational communities between individuals and groups within the far right. I just want to put out a quick reminder on the admin side that to please keep putting your questions in the Q&A box on the conference platform. It is a much better experience. I think everyone can get there. And if you would like to utilize the networking feature to talk to other attendees, you just have to go into your profile at the top right of the screen and click on a box to allow that feature to be enabled. Okay, so a quick word from me on the content of this session to sort of give it a little bit of context, I think. So I think it's important to note that there is a little bit of an arbitrary point in trying to separate out the online, offline, and ideological connections, as these are so interconnected, of course. We had to do it today to make it manageable session lengths, but the aim of this session is sort of to draw out, to highlight how there are multi-dimensional ideological underpinnings that are often supporting a more overt ideological position of these networks and groups in both their online and offline interactions. The themes of anti-feminist, anti-LGBTQ+, misogynist views often run alongside racism throughout many ideological strands on the far right, as well as often a complicated interconnection of ultra-conservative religious viewpoints. So for example, a group that may espouse to be a neo-Nazi white supremacist group often also has an underpinning of misogynist, ultranationalist, or even ultra-religious Christian ideological themes running throughout it as well. It's important, I think, to note also that at the end of the day, while Islamist extremism is often seen at odds with the far right, they are essentially two sides of the same coin, both at the far right ultra-conservative end of the spectrum alongside ultra-conservative Christianism and other religious perspectives. All of this sort of discursively forms the multifaceted foundations of groups that exist in the spectrum and often, ultimately informs their engagements in the physical realm as well. We'll hear in this session about both these ideological and physical connections, including specific case studies from across the US, the UK, Western and Eastern Europe. Events that bring these networks and groups together in the physical world for things like paramilitary gatherings, music festivals, sporting competitions, and other types of events. I'm really pleased to welcome to our expert panel today. We will hear from Naureen Chowdhury Fink, but via recording. She is the Executive Director of the Soufan Center and previously served as the Senior Policy Advisor on Counterterrorism and Sanctions at the United Kingdom's mission to the United Nations. We will also hear from Ann-Kathrin Rothermel, who is a research associate at the University of Potsdam in Germany and a research fellow at the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, as well as the Berlin Graduate School for Global and Transregional Studies. Then we'll have Dr. Alexander Ritzmann, who is a senior advisor for the Countering Extremism project, He's been working on the promotion of liberal democracy and the prevention of violent extremism for 20 years. And we will wrap up with Dr. Kacper Rekawek, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. And he's had more than 15 years of experience in this field across different sectors. So I'm going to ask that we please play the video from Naureen first, and then we'll move on to the speakers who we have live today.
Hello, my name is Naureen Chowdhury Fink, and I'm the Executive Director of the Soufan Center, an independent organization focused on research, analysis, and strategic dialogue on global security issues. A big thank you to RUSI for the invitation to join you today, and I really hope that sometime soon we can do this in real life again over a cup of coffee in hand, perhaps. It gives me particular pleasure to join this fantastic panel and to be able to talk about extreme right-wing terrorism. Since the publication of our 2019 report on white supremacy extremism, we've been highlighting the increased threats such groups pose, as well as their transnational linkages. And just a few weeks ago, we published our latest report in partnership with the Ari Neve Trust UK, called A Perfect Storm: Insurrection, Incitement, and the Violent Far-Right Movement, which focuses on the current and potential impacts of the January 6th insurrection in the US and the UK. Our report highlighted 3 layers of connections we noted, and which should shape future thinking about the nature of transnational connections. These are ideological, financial, and operational, by which we also mean physical convening, strategic planning and coordination, and exchanges of learning material. These 3 layers will also shape the kinds of policy and practice responses that we need in order to address the different nuances of these kinds of connections. So our report talks quite a bit about how we've seen groups that have physically connected domestically and transnationally, as well as other types of connections. And I think one thing we often forget, and we really wanted to stress, is that January 6th itself was an important physical and communal experience. I think that just, we often forget that behind those photographs of groups storming the building and, the erection of a gallows and the chants of hang Mike Pence and things like that, there's a large group of people there all in one place. And I think the images of that and the reality of that physical sort of mass that gathered on the Capitol and endangered the lives of so many law enforcement officers and lawmakers, the sheer physical size of it and that communal experience of it is quite important to think about, because when we see those images, we need to remember the kind of mass behind it and the experiences of people that were part of it. And I think also importantly, when others see those images, they're not just looking at, the Capitol building, they're looking at a group of people in a common endeavor, to challenge a legitimate government. They've seen kind of that barrier broken by this physical group of people that charged the building. So I think remembering that January 6th itself was a very important physical and communal experience, and that the images thereof continue to be important motivators and propaganda is something to really be thinking about. But we know that, conflicts themselves in other instances have drawn foreign fighters, has drawn, masses of those with those common interests. I mean, in the case of ISIS, we saw nearly 20,000 people travel to join or support them. And we've seen, 15,000 to 17,000 travel to Ukraine to support various sides of the conflict. And we've seen that, as many of the reports indicate, we've seen that many of them travel and value kind of that lived experience of combat, of camaraderie, that kind of band of brothers experience, and particularly more so when it's married to kind of ideological narratives and objectives that matter to them. But we've seen that sort of physical experience of combat and camaraderie, the thrill of the fight, that forging of common bonds among fighters has been a very important attraction, and we think that it's really worth noting that this is not just a sort of jihadist phenomenon. Certainly Ukraine belied that, any thoughts of that. Adding to this is the fact that this is a very gendered discourse with, mostly men selling, and some women, selling ideals of masculinity, and that these physical connections are often very much rooted in these kind of stereotypes of, masculinity, whether it's about warrior images, provider images, protector concepts, and a lot of the ways that it's done are centered on sort of stereotypically male-associated activities. We know in the case of ISIS, it was unprecedented that an estimated 20% of those traveling to the conflict zones were women. Many were supporters, ideologues, victims, perpetrators. But we know that many women were there, and many of them also bought into the very stereotyped notions of sort of masculinity. So, I mean, a deep discussion on gender was beyond the scope of this particular report, but we do highlight the important symbolic roles of women and gender and the sort of very gendered discourse of the far-right community, and how that, that does shape the way they interact physically and the kinds of activities that they undertake. We know that COVID-19 has put a damper on a lot of communal activities and travel, but we also know that these groups have had a long history of bringing supporters and followers together through concerts, rallies, sports. These serve not only an important community building exercise, as we know, but also a very important fundraising platform. And I think that the linkage between that communal experience and that notion of fundraising and sort of organizational development it's something really important, and it will be important to see sort of in a post-pandemic, I hope we get there sometime soon, but in a post-pandemic environment, how these activities translate or whether they're adapted into a hybrid format in some way. Although the insurrection of January 6th feels in many ways a lifetime ago, it is still early to fully appreciate the full spectrum of the impact. However, we've seen that far-right groups widely celebrated and lionized the insurrectionists. And as I said earlier, those images, that story of the sort of breaking of the line and entering the Capitol, we've seen that resonate around the world in many far-right groups, and we've seen that there's increased online interest in many US-based groups, certainly in the aftermath. Moreover, I think the actions at the Capitol really burnish the image of American far-right groups as doers rather than thinkers, bringing the ideological and operational weight of the movement to this side of the Atlantic. I mean, ideologically, we know that there have been many deep historical connections between far-right groups in the US and the UK and Europe, so we know that in itself isn't new. But our report underscored that the future of the violent far-right movement, whether it's in the UK or other countries, is going to be very deeply impacted by developments in the United States. The report does stress that the continued rise of neo-Nazi ideology and violent white supremacy is a global phenomenon, and increasing connections and linkages between far-right extremists will strengthen not only the existing networks, but also give rise to new ones. I think another interesting dimension of the physical connections between such groups has been the use and sort of sale of merchandise and material to boost not only fundraising and mobilization efforts, but create a kind of, very visible manifestation of their ideological linkages. But it's quite physical, right? It's your belt buckle, it's your clothing brand, it's your paraphernalia, photographs and sort of, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, belt buckles and things like that. So, as I was saying, like, this merchandise, I think, is quite important because it is a physical manifestation of common aims, goals, ideals among the groups. And we know that for that very reason, in many countries, they are in fact outlawed and, they would be illegal. However, in the US, where there is no domestic far-right groups, designated as a terrorist and no legislation against it, such transactions remain permissible and the activities of such groups remain largely unrestricted. The ongoing court case regarding Charlottesville, I think, will be particularly interesting in this regard, where, the victims are suing the organizers, and that could set very important precedents for far-right groups organizing and coordinating, actual physical sort of manifestations like rallies and things like that. We'll see what comes out of that court case. Much attention has been on online activities, which is not surprising given that the past 18 months, have been lived largely online. But we know that online activities can be important indicators of offline interests and vice versa. And many people go online to seek out the things that, that they care about or they want to know more about in the first place. So it's therefore imperative that we also pay close attention to the enabling factors in the environment that create a hospitable, kind of area to boost support and participation in far-right groups. The socioeconomic fallout of the pandemic, perceptions and experiences of inequality and marginalization, institutionalized acceptance of conspiracy theories, legitimization of disinformation and polarization. All of these kind of factors in real life in the community we see as very important to address because they are shaping not only online activities but certainly offline, drivers and motivators. But shifting from problem to solution, our recent report also highlighted several concrete and action-oriented recommendations focused on, boosting community resilience and understanding the threat, and also heightening the cost of entry for far-right groups into terrorist activities. Recommendations include investing in additional research and analysis and building on lessons learned from practitioner communities and states that have successfully dealt with the threat, developing in the US, for example, a national framework for prevention, and considering the designation as foreign terrorist organizations of foreign chapters of US-based groups. We also stress the importance of assessing the impact of prescriptions and designations in countries like the UK, which have taken a forward-leaning approach to this, and also investing more heavily in disengagement and rehabilitation programs and civil society initiatives, many of which are working with members of far-right movements to sort of bring them out of it and reintegrate them into mainstream society. We also stress the value of working with international organizations to apply, wherever relevant, existing counterterrorism tools and resources to the threat of far-right terrorism. I think it's worth briefly noting that there is a tremendous discrepancy between the treatment of physical interactions for extreme right-wing groups and for ISIL, Al-Qaeda associated, jihadist groups. This is particularly stark when you look at the sweeping measures that have been prompted, for example, by a UN Security Council Resolution 2396 and the work of the US and the coalition and everything that went into defeating the territorial caliphate and addressing foreign terrorist fighters. Physical interactions between violent far-right groups and members carry few, if any, comparable penalties. So I think that discrepancy is something that we also really need to keep an eye on. I just wanted to close by saying that, we're not starting from scratch in addressing the transnational dimensions of violent far-right groups. On the domestic front, we highlight several approaches that have been taken by countries such as the UK, where they've developed ideologically agnostic frameworks and tools that can be applied to a large number of groups, whether they're violent far-right or jihadist, and even where these were maybe initially developed just for jihadist groups in mind. Similarly, several UN frameworks and Security Council tools can be directed towards addressing risks posed by far-right groups, particularly in the space of addressing terrorist financing and countering terrorist narratives. We've highlighted several of these in issue briefs earlier this summer produced by the Soufan Center, and we know that it remains a critical ongoing discussion in the international community about how we can together, multilaterally, internationally, address this increasingly transnationalizing threat. Thank you very much, and I look forward to keeping this conversation going.
I'll say thank you to Naureen for those words for us on the recording. And then, Ann-Kathrin, I'll hand over to you next, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jess, for inviting me to be part of the launch of this very important program here at RUSI. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Let me know if anything doesn't work with that. Okay. So I'd like to use my time today to share with you some observations from my research concerning transnational and cross-ideological connections in far-right discourses. I want to specifically focus on two aspects from my research, which I think are especially relevant to the topic of this conference, and for which I also see the need for future research and policy work. The first point is on the role of geographic locations in far-right and specifically in anti-feminist, male supremacist discourses, and how these locations do influence mobilization and radicalization in these spaces. And in the second point, I want to move away from discourses within far-right groups and zoom in on the ways in which male and white supremacist ideas have become connected in current press and practitioner discourses, and what problems I see with that from a feminist perspective. So to dive right in, one of the questions that has come up repeatedly here in previous presentations is about how regressive and often deeply nationalistic movements do transcend national boundaries. And a while back, I looked at this at the example of men's rights, anti-feminist groups in the US, in India, and in Russia. And the goal was to find out how they frame their collective identities in regards to nationalistic versus transnational signifiers and identity markers, and how this then works or functions to mobilize their supporters. You can see the citation for the paper that came out of this research below. But quickly, what I found was that geographic locations do play a recurring role in regards to three elements of anti-feminist discourses, namely victimhood, values, and threats. And while this analysis was exclusively done on anti-feminist groups, I think that these elements will probably ring familiar to a lot of people here studying other groups on the far right as well. And I will talk a little bit about which aspects I think can be abstracted beyond the context of men's rights communities in the over the course of this presentation. So, but to start off, victimhood in the discourses that I studied was generally framed in a local way. It was illustrated through examples such as alcoholism in Russia, unemployment in the US, and divorce rates in India, which were understood as local problems which unfairly affect and victimize men in current society. So, uh, very much painting a picture that was particular to the local context and in which the nation state was rejected by anti-feminists on the basis of these grievances because it was considered as a feminized system that neglects the need of men and only unfairly favors women. This very negative assessment of the national context was then juxtaposed with a rather abstract ideal society based on patriarchal values and strict gender inequality. And these values did actually remain mostly abstract, but sometimes they were illustrated through either images of long lost national historical contexts, such as pre-Soviet times in Russia, and other times they were illustrated through transnational comparisons with more patriarchal societies abroad, which were like kind of highlighted as a beacon of hope, so to say. But third, and I think this is probably or maybe the most important factor for a lot of far right movements whose mobilization is centrally based on fear is the construction of an all powerful enemy or threat. And in the case of anti feminist movements, this enemy is, of course, feminism and feminists and individual and groups of feminists. And feminists were here constructed as in control of all means of power, as inherently violent, but at the same time also as feminized in the sense that they're considered as irrational and men-hating, and they're also considered to be a globally active force. So this combination of like powerful, violent, global, and feminized produces the ultimate securitized and even existential threat to the members of these anti-feminist groups, which then reinforces and heightens this what was previously this local victimhood experience into a global sense of oppression, which then also provides an impetus for potential transnational solidarity with other victims in other societies. And on a side note, I think what's really interesting here is that this combination of feminized and powerful is also visible beyond anti-feminist communities. For example, in anti-liberal or anti-Semitic tropes, whereby feminism is often also weaved in as, for example, a Jewish conspiracy. What I want to highlight here is that the ways in which these global and local ascriptions to victimhood values and threats work and function together are very dependent on the movement studied. So they vary across the communities that I looked at. But whatever the combination was, both elements were really important for the communities to create a mobilization impetus, a collective identity, and the solidarity across borders. So what I think is like interesting to future programming and research on far right extremism and terrorism is that it might be important to not lose sight of that fact that while there is an increasing level of transnational organization and networking, the local specificities and grievances do remain an important factor for the mobilization within far-right groups. And when looking at particular far-right groups and their transnational organizing, it therefore makes sense to look also into how exactly they frame themselves in connection to local and transnational signifiers to better understand the impact that both their mobilization efforts and the resulting activism might have. Moving on to the second aspect that I want to highlight today, on cross-ideological connections between white supremacist and male supremacist ideologies and how they are understood in mainstream media and counterterrorism discourses. Especially in the media, but also to a certain degree in policymaking, there has been a tendency to speak about the connection between misogyny and the far right in terms of a gateway drug. The gateway drug thesis basically just assumes that misogyny is a gateway to other far-right ideologies, in particular to white supremacy and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. As I have mentioned before, it's very clear that these ideologies are connected, right? We have had a lot of previous presenters already give some insights into how white supremacist groups and their ideologies are gendered in different ways. And also Naureen mentioned that quickly. We have also evidence from researchers studying male supremacism about the role that race and other intersectional discriminations play in that. But the problem with the gateway drug thesis is that it presupposes a sequence whereby anti-feminist, misogynist ideas are presented as a first step or a precursor to what is presumed to be more extreme ideologies. And first of all, so there are two problems that I see with that. First of all, we do not actually have any hard evidence of this sequence. So most studies that kind of insinuate this connection do identify interconnections between the ideologies, but there is no clear sequential pathway of radicalization that could be abstracted, say, beyond maybe like a few leaders that have moved from the manosphere, the male supremacist space of the manosphere, to white supremacist groups. And the fact that despite this lack of evidence, the sequence is so often assumed is because there's still an ongoing normalization of violent misogyny in our societies. And this normalization, just to quickly illustrate this, can, for example, be seen in these types of questions in the media discourse, where observers are uncertain if male supremacist attacks do count as terrorist attacks. And it can also be seen more recently in some arguments that have been brought into the discussion here in the UK about whether misogyny should become legally considered a hate crime. What I think is important here for programming and future research is that when we're considering the connections between gender and other ideologies in the far-right spectrum, it has to be made very clear that violent misogyny is not mainly included and considered because it might be leading to white supremacist radicalization, but it should instead be clear that male supremacism is an extreme far-right ideology in its own right, which is also connected to white supremacy. And if we don't do this, I think we are in danger of perpetuating a way of thinking that trivializes misogynist violence as a kind of minor, apolitical, less extreme and excusable type of violence, which in turn can then provide legitimacy to male supremacist and misogynist narratives and reinforce systemic violence from such groups. So again, there's still much more that needs to be researched and covered, and I think the research program RUSI is launching today will play a really important role in the effort to fill the gaps that we still have in front of us. Out of the many aspects, I have tried to just highlight 2 points, both of which do call for a complex consideration of discursive interconnections, both between global and local identity markers, as well as between white and male supremacist ideologies. I will leave it at that, and I am very much looking forward to the future conversations and important research that will come out of this program. Thank you again for having me here.
Thank you, Ann-Kathrin. I think that was a very interesting presentation on sort of the ideological connections and how we should think about them. I'm going to move on right into Alexander and Kacper. I'm going to say them together because I think they're somewhat tag teaming on a joint report that they have worked on. So let's go to Alexander first, and then we'll go on to Kacper.
Well, thank you very much for having me, for the opportunity to share the insights that we worked on at the Counter-Extremism Project. So CEP, for those who don't know us, Transatlantic Think and Do Tank, meaning we do research and we do advocacy work. We focus on Islamist extremism and far-right extremism. And content-wise, we look into financial strategies, de-radicalization, and online regulation. So I'm going to start my presentation on particularly the offline parts of what has been discussed all day. So here, operational hubs. You see on the right side in a corner the violent right-wing extremism terrorism study that we did for the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, where we looked at 6 countries, the US, UK, France, Germany, Finland, and Sweden, and tried to give a good assessment. And Kacper was in the lead of this study. I was a co-author, and we basically split some of the findings, but Kacper has its own work in addition to that. So what I'm trying to highlight here now is that in our reading, in my reading, a new leaderless, transnational, apocalyptic, violence-oriented, extreme right-wing movement has been emerged. Now we can discuss all the different words mentioned here, but this is like the hypothesis that I'm trying to share with you here. So we saw operational hubs, meaning this is where people meet in terms of concerts and big festivals. That's not really a new development, just the size and some of the professionalism of some of the events is a new phenomenon, but I don't have time to dive into that. We have the mixed martial arts, or in general combat sports. There's an increased trend of really training this body of the white warrior, also with bigger events with transnational character, but also smaller studios and other associations that focus on that. We have, of course, the traditional marches and political demonstrations and events like that. And then we have the narratives. And I just want to highlight this briefly, because from my perspective, there has been a game changer, especially from a German perspective, where it was always about the Germans, the German far-right extremists, the Nazis, the superior folk, so to say. And that has shifted maybe over the last 10 years to the white supremacy, also based on a threat towards the white race. So the logic behind that is, if the white race is under threat by the great replacement, by, as just mentioned, feminism, liberalism, coming from the worldwide conspiracy, that cannot be tackled from an extremist perspective by being just Germans and French and British. They have to see that as the white race being under threat, and hence cooperate on a different level that they have been cooperating all along, of course. So the transnational dimension is not really new by itself. One could say far-right extremism is a transnational ideology. But there has been a shift in narratives that I find interesting, and the apocalyptic part is maybe the essential one, the existential threat by what I just mentioned that they share is supposed to be the case, which also then justifies and maybe even calls for violence, right? So if your family, if your village, if your state, if your race is being close to being exterminated, that of course calls for violence, and I think that's an important lesson. The study goes into depth in into all these questions, and it's going to be in the presentation that's going to be sent around, and it's also here in the documentation for the conference. To give this a framing, I thought of an unorganized collective. So a lot of actors here, despite you seeing the logos of some of the groups that we looked into, there's a lot of individuals who are not members of any groups, right? The folks we call lone actors, but they feel connected and united by shared narratives, values, and enemies. And this is very important. This is, to a degree, a different kind of extremism and terrorism, especially important for those folks who have been focusing on Islamist extremism, which has much more structure and hierarchy than this part of the phenomenon. So challenges and opportunities. Shared understanding is what we need about the real size and nature of the phenomena. So that's plural, right? I'm not talking about the whole scene. What I'm referring to is a transnational oriented milieu, one of several, for example, in Germany or in Europe, which has professionalized their activities and strategies. So this is not just dumb neo-Nazis drinking beer, yelling, and then maybe attacking someone on the way to the next beer. This is about people really building the milieu, fueling the milieu, which then calls for violence as a response, as a supposedly legitimate response to the supposed big threat picture. So this is what's being called stochastic terrorism, a terrible term, I know, but it means that there's no hierarchy here. There's no attack order. There's just this general noise, this constant flow of terrible news that calls for every able person to join the supposedly legitimate fight. And this is a challenge because a lot of this violence is no flag operations. There's no public affairs committee behind it. There's no press release. There's not necessarily any clear declaration. We have the manifestos, of course, but a lot of the violence that I've been talking about here comes without manifestos and hence is not necessarily being seen as what it is. And the other thing is the focus on the attacker, which we have here in this so-called lone wolf discussion, which I think it's more or less clear now that these lone wolves are not alone. They don't feel alone, but we focus often too much on the operation and not so much on the supporting and motivating milieus. And especially online, there has been a shift that I don't see reflected in many of the presentations here of extreme normalization. I'm mentioning this because these are the essential offline actors who have adjusted their strategy. So they don't violate the terms of service of the platforms anymore. They just make money there on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram. And we're publishing a study on this at the CEP for the German far-right extremist scene, the who is who, the movers and shakers. And it might be a surprise to a lot of people that most of them, or a big part of them, are still on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. They just make money there and recruit people. They don't violate the terms of service anymore. And the last part is very important: strategic disruption. There needs to be cooperation. It takes a network to beat a network. And we're far from being an established network in this phenomenon. Of course, it took a decade or longer in the Islamist extremism terrorism sphere to really get some sort of a network character. And to a degree, this is just starting the transatlantic understanding. And we need administrative interventions, banning events, banning alcohol at events, taking the fun away, so to say, Schengen visa, limiting the range of key actors to travel. Training of local staff. A lot of local, employees at municipalities don't really know the details of who is applying for a permit for a music festival, right? So then it's a lot of work needs to be done here. And the crime extremism nexus. There's an enlightening case in Germany of one extremist group who is involved in trafficking, drugs, illegal prostitution. And that's why we have, in another report that's also here in this presentation, we promote the EU administrative approach, which is from organized crime, because in the extremism field, we often look at the individual. There's an individual offense or there's a group, but we don't look into what else these folks are doing, also into their legal activities. And this is an established procedure, we can call it the Capone Method, going after maybe tax fraud and other things, not with everyone in the scene, of course, but the key figures, the movers and shakers, disrupting their path and their activities, I guess, is the solution here, that at least hinders them from growing and hinders them from achieving what they're trying to achieve to a degree. And this is the report. As I said, you will have access to that. And I'm not going into this here. I'm just showing you how well connected the German far-right extremist scene is. So everything here in yellow is a specific group in Germany. And on the bottom, the red items here, these are transnational hubs, and they're all in Eastern Europe. And that's the transition to Kacper's presentation. And I just want to say one more thing. There was a time when the Germans were laughing about the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs and saying, these losers, they're occupying our country, our territory, basically. Now this has changed. The godfathers of far-right extremism in Germany turn to Eastern Europe and say they will be saving the Western world. So the neo-Nazis in Germany and Western Europe have understood that there needs to be a focus on Eastern Europe. And I'm not sure that policymakers and researchers have understood this enough, at least so far. So that's it from my end, and I'm giving over to Kacper.
Thank you, Alexander. That was really, really enlightening. And I'll just go straight to you, Kacper, because I know you're going to pick up where he left off.
Yes, thank you for that, Jessica. Thank you for the kind introduction, also, Alexander, and bringing me into the conversation. I won't surprise you. I mean, I'll focus on but I would say the three earlier speakers spoke about bigger things, the things that you need to understand, I guess, first before you actually take a dive into a case study. And okay, my case study is not a case study of a single country, but more of a region. And I was asked by RUSI, and thank you for having me, and good idea to have such a program. So kudos to Jessica, Claudia, and all the others involved. I was asked to look at what is often called the Eastern Europe, what I call Central Europe, and what maybe we could, in a consensual way, call Central Eastern Europe. So anything to the east of Germany, to the southeast of Germany. That's what I'm going to look at really quickly in a couple of points. And I literally have one slide, basically I hope you can see it already. I'm just gonna try to bring it up on screen. So essentially there are 6 points that I want to cover, and I'll try to go by these really quickly, because I guess we need some time for discussion as well. So essentially, as Alexander said, there's an interesting development that there are new kids on the block. For those old enough, maybe you still remember this boy band, that are basically now seated at the table of the global far right or the global extreme right. And these new kids on the block are, yes, quite often from what I would call, inverted commas, my part of Europe. Now, you have to remember that this part of Europe still, to some extent, does have what we would call a big brother complex. So because I'm originally Polish, although now working in Norway at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, we still do look at the Westerners and compare ourselves constantly to the Westerners, and trying to actually see our achievements and our failures vis-a-vis the achievements and the failures of the Westerners. And quite often we find out that they only have achievements. So that is a kind of that's a state which sometimes worry the people here in this region. But basically, this is a quote from one of my interviewees who said, a Polish extremist, if you like, who basically said, look, we've been checking out the Westerners for quite some time, everything we did in the circle, everything in the milieu, everything we looked at, everything we wore, all the music that we listened to, it was basically all done while comparing what we do to what our brethren are doing in the West. And at the time when we were doing that, we had no way of contacting them. There was no internet. There were hardly any mobile phones, and if there were, charges on these mobile phones were extremely expensive, and it was extremely tough for these guys to actually get in touch. Now, on the other side, and as Alexander mentioned that, for quite some time, the approach from the extreme right or the far right more generally towards the Easterners was like that of, well, they looked down on the Easterners, even the Easterners who actually thought like, who actually were thinking along the same lines. They were still quite often seen, and that's another quote from another interviewee of mine from Central Eastern Europe, who said, well, we used to be just like Muslims to them. We were the threat. We were the kind of like rabble residing east of Germany that would come, take their jobs, and change their country for the worse. And then suddenly things began to move at some point in the 1990s, but especially after 2001, he said. So essentially, you're having this long process. You're having this long process of these two sides of the same coin, as Alexander rightly pointed out, actually getting in touch with each other. And of course, we could blame technology for that, and rightly so. But at the same time, there are other elements that come into play. And these two elements for me are essentially the neighborly meetings. So they would meet each other. You have this, and Alexander flagged this up in his presentation, that it's not far from certain parts of Germany to Western Czech Republic, where you can go and actually try to shop for guns and ammunition. That's one of the kind of like a conduit for these meetings. But there are other also, and there are Polish extremists are very keen on reaching out to their German brethren, because they really want to hang out with the Germans, because they are the marker. They set, they basically set the bar in this milieu, in their view, and they kind of, so what can we do with them? Well, we can invite them for a kind of like a quasi-paramilitary camp, or we can invite things for them in our mountains. It's cheap. The beer is cheaper. It's not better, but it's cheaper. The weather's okay. It's the same as in Germany mostly. So let's have you over. And for some Germans, and this is the kind of neighborly connection, this is an attractive offer. And these camps start in the early 1990s. We're not looking at something that started 5 years ago or 20 years ago. It really is early 1990s. Okay, they're not huge. They don't produce great success at the same time, but those connections are kind of coming together. But I think the big boost is the immigration. So essentially, you have a situation in which quite a few of the extremists from the East migrate to Western Europe, basically in search for jobs. And it happens in the 1990s in a small way, but it happens massively after 2004, especially if you're looking at the polls. So you've got the situation in the UK, but you've got the situation, a long-standing Polish community in Germany. You have them moving to Scandinavia, but it's not only Poles, it's Lithuanians, Latvians, it's to a lesser extent Czechs, but it's also Slovaks, to some extent Hungarians. And suddenly you find out that whole organizations from Central Eastern Europe now suddenly are in the UK, for example. Or there are organizations like that who are moving also from Russia to Ukraine for a completely different reason. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but you have them moving. The borders are open, there are possibilities, there are friends, there are connections. We can reach out, we can establish close cooperation. So essentially you have a situation in globalization turns anti-globalist forces into friends. And the Westerners then have this kind of, enlightened moment when they say, okay, right, these guys are all white, they're coming from traditional white, predominantly Christian societies, they have no Muslims, they have no blacks. It's actually what we should be. And they have it. They're less materialistic. They allegedly they are about the things we should care about. And really, why not hold them up as some kind of a model? Of course, it kind of goes into a bit of a self-parody as we go on, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is something that also Alexander mentioned, that you have this shift. The shift in thinking, there's a bit of a geographical shift as well. And the plot really thickens after 2014 and 2015. 2015 is the migrant crisis, and we all know that this is a boost for the far right around Europe, because migrants or refugees are moving, and the new kids on the block suddenly appear at the table saying, hey, we also have these issues because they are traversing through Central, Eastern, Southern Europe. Well, let's join for a common cause to essentially defeat Muslims. And suddenly, those voices are heard, those voices are appreciated. But another impulse there is the Russo-Ukrainian war of 2014, where basically this shuffles the cards in extreme right-wing circles in Eastern Europe. So suddenly some of the extreme right-wing people in Russia decide not to fight for Putin's Russia, but to fight for Ukraine, and they move to Ukraine to fight Russian troops. Let's play this again in our heads, that they basically go there to fight their compatriots, to fight against some of Russian imperial nationalists who deploy on the so-called separatist side, and they basically shoot at their brethren from the far-right circles who move to Ukraine, because they're saying, just like the Westerners are saying about Central Europe, the Russians are saying about Kiev, hey, Kiev is this glorious city where you can be yourself. You're a nationalist, but you're not locked up in jail, you're not repressed. There are no Muslims here, which is not true, by the way. It is a pretty traditional place, and it's almost it's the same language, or almost the same language, it's the same cultural space, etc., etc., etc. We should be together. So you have this kind of unifying factor, and that only strengthens the cards of the Easterners. Ukrainians are suddenly pumped up with energy, new recruits, and a very important narrative when they say, well, look, we fought in a war. What did you do? You far-right person from the West. Like, how can you impress me? That is now a complete reversal of trends. Okay, the Westerner can still impress, with the connections, with the sophistication, if I could put it this way, with sometimes with the money. but certainly not with the kind of, streetwise, if I could put it this way, activism. Because suddenly, you have the Ukrainians being on top there with the Russians very much included. So you almost see a complete reversal of roles in this sphere. Of course, this is also connected with, far-right tourism around trademark Central Eastern European events. So you have these events, these big, Alexander spoke about some of these in relation to, for example, Germany. You've got such events in Central Eastern Europe where basically huge crowds are being attracted, and one of them is coming up in basically like a week on the 11th of November in Warsaw. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But almost any far-right scene in any Central Eastern European country now has a trademark event to which foreigners will be coming. They will be coming because there are cheap flights. It's still cheaper, yet still more kind of like home. Yet at the same time, not like home, because it's homogeneous, white, Christian, etc., etc., etc. So this kind of, it's a double pleasure. It's like Western Europe in terms of fun you can have, but at the same time, it's not like Western Europe because it's so different from Western Europe because there aren't any Muslims, there aren't any blacks. What a great place to be, and you can still enjoy yourself for relatively less money that you would pay in the West. And essentially, these events, they also play a negative role. For the milieu, if I could put it this way, because essentially it structures the whole operation of the local extreme far or the far right around these days. They become hubs, but they also become bottlenecks. They mobilize the local milieu for a day, 2, 3 days a week, a year, but then at the same time, for quite a lot of the rest of the year, they are all over the place and they are arguing with one another, and they cannot put up something like this yet again. So that, we have to remember about that when we're looking at it. And the final point I wanted to make is that quite often these events are seen as a kind of like a harbinger of a kind of a Shangri-La type of a situation for these far-right people who are coming here. If you listen to the podcasts by Robert Rundo and Denis Nikitin, you would be under the impression that this is the best place, right? Serbia and the local, the neighbors this is precisely what we want. And, you can go into a museum and it's a European museum, and, when you hear people like that speaking about that kind of a cultural side of things, you have to laugh a bit. But it's not like that. The connections are deep, Western, Eastern, but the local connections sometimes are surprising. And I get quite a lot of people asking me about the connections between these extreme right groups and the local governments. And you'd be surprised to see how the local governments actually hate that kind of, far-right tourism because it embarrasses them on the international stage. So, it really, there is another dimension here that I hope Fred will look at. I hope we will appreciate. And I think, yes, there are new kids on the block. They are still stumbling a bit, but there has been a surprising, reversal of roles. And I think it would be good to study that and look at it in more detail. And I hope this could be one of the pathways for Fred to look at and to go down. And I'll happily help with that. So thank you again for having me, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I think that was really interesting, Kacper, and raised a couple of good points that you're right we should look at in future, I think. We do have a few questions, and we have a limited leftover amount of time, so I'm going to go straight into those. And Ann-Kathrin, I'm going to start with one for you, and I'm going to bundle it with another one, just try and see if we can point this to everyone. But the one to start with for you particularly is about the question of whether designation of misogynist or incel violence as terrorism would help sort of society treat this as a more serious issue or a serious ideology of the far right, or would it ultimately cause more problems? And I think, that doesn't directly link, but I'm going to link it to another question that I'll start with you on, but I want to see if Alexander and Kacper also want to answer this one about whether you see, in your looking across locations and types of events, that there is an increasing role for women. Are there women that participate in these events? Is that number going up or down? Are they being drawn into the far right now differently in this more organized, fashion that you're talking about across your reports? But let me start with Ann-Kathrin. You can answer of that what you will, and then we can go on to Alexander and Kacper.
All right. So about the question about terrorism designation, I do think that it would be beneficial in order to make clear that misogyny, violent misogyny, and male supremacism is a political type of violence and a political extreme type of violence. What I think the person asking the question was alluding to with the danger of this is something that we can already see as, for example, incels have become more discussed in the mainstream. There's a tendency to then like assign the incel label as the extremist label to groups and like acts that aren't actually perpetrated by people who necessarily identify as incels in any way, or identify as this subgroup of far-right communities. And I think that is related though to the point that I was making earlier, because what that shows to me is that there's this kind of need to kind of push away this type of extreme violence from from the misogyny that is underlying our societies, and pushing it into an extreme space of like what is often also, incels are often portrayed as this absurd group, I guess, like kind of like, yes, they're violent, but they're also weird, and like they're certainly far away, right? Like, and I think that is maybe the danger of having them having inceldom as a type of terrorism designation, which has come up in discussions, because then it gives an opportunity to trivialize misogyny in the societies as something that is disconnected from this extreme fringe group, which it is not, right? It's the underlying current, and that is also what we need to address when we're including violent misogyny in counterterrorism efforts. Moving to the second question about the women joining far-right groups, right? So I have to say I'm studying mostly male supremacist groups, and as as a part of that is a rejection of women, and I mean mainly feminism, but also women more broadly. There is not so many women joining these groups. There are groups like super fringe groups in these communities that are specifically for women. There's also female incels, but I haven't studied those in detail, and I would not expect that to become like a more mainstream thing to be said. I mean, what I could also say is, but that would be rather speculative because I also haven't looked at women joining far-right groups, but I think that maybe with the emergence of the alt-right, that the savviness that we have also heard about in the previous panel, that the tech savviness has enabled specific targeting of a broader variety of groups, and I think women would also fall into that category. For example, with like there has been a couple of stories about Instagram mommies becoming radicalized into more conspiracy type groups, and I think that is due to the ability of online media to kind of cater to specific aesthetics and groups.
Thank you. Ann-Kathrin, I think that is useful to think about. I wonder, Alexander and Kacper, in your studies, did you sort of see women participating? I know these are often heavily misogynist sort of groups, or, you know, there's expectations of what it means to be a man in these groups, but do you see women participating?
I'm actually, so what I look at, these are more like counter society projects, right? So the far right extremists from a strategic perspective wants to build a different society. So they need women. So from that angle, they are not misogynist, they are anti-feminist. Women are wooed, there's specific channels and approaches to attract them. You can hear far-right extremists crying on podcasts why so few women join them and why it's so hard to find a good German woman or something. So to them, that is a major issue. And to them, it's more about the role models that have been explained, right? That this setup of the warrior and the protector and the provider and the mother of the nation, who is also responsible for the logistics. And the violent groups that we look, the terrorist groups, far-right extremist groups that tried to commit attacks and were arrested, the amount of women in the prosecution were about 10 to 15%. So that's not a small, not a big, or also not a small number, because these are the real violent operations. But the bigger milieus try to attract women. So they're not necessarily talking down on women. They are rather trying, with us, you can be whoever you want to be as long as you stay within the role that is predefined, right? So this is a contradiction, but they're really trying to attract women. They need them to build this, from their perspective, better society.
Yeah, and then on that point, I would just add that yes, there is a lot of work put into the attempt to recruit women. Somehow, either on the radical or the extreme right, there's hardly any of them visible. So you have this kind of, there's a problem of output in a sense, or maybe that's not a problem, really. But then again, if you want to become popular in societies that, you'd be surprised, but the role of women in Central Eastern European societies, despite the imagery, it's actually quite strong, and you really have to get to them like politically and socially to be successful as a socio-political project, because to a large extent they run our societies, and I'm saying that without any hint of irony. And somehow you cannot square this. Maybe some of the radical right groups are radical right, I stress, more successful with younger women, yes, but still the kind of mainstream that you want to vote for you, to appreciate you and stuff like that, that's still a difficult and a tricky territory for them.
Thanks, everyone. I don't want to, I'm sorry to, we have to cut the Q&A short just because we're running low on time here, but I'm going to put one more question to you, Alexander, about sort of finance, because I think this will lead in quite well to our fourth session, which will come after a quick break. And I'm sorry to sort of deny Kacper and Ann-Kathrin of last words, but thank you very much. So Alexander, maybe Kacper, you'll add to this as well, but there was a question around sort of, you mentioned making money on social media platforms. I don't know, around using music events or MMA fighting to do that, but could you sort of give an example of how that's done? And then this conversation around finance will be picked up again in the next session.
So this is a very important point, because there's a narrative that on the big platforms, far-right extremists are really no longer present. And our research we just finished, the report is going to be published next week, shows that they just switched strategy. So they don't do hate speech there. They don't violate the terms of service. They have all their online shops linked to their Facebook profiles or Instagram. So they give an image of being happy people on vacation in Mexico, enjoying the bike tours and the waterfalls. And here is the clothesline we have for our mixed martial arts events for women, for children, and for fighters. Or here's the music event, here are the CDs, so they build this whole parallel society that they try to build in offline. They built this online to a degree by selling all the merchandise that you need to feel part of that group, that identity, all the signaling you can do by buying all these products. And they have hundreds of thousands of followers, some of them in total aggregated in Facebook, on Facebook, for example, in Germany. And these are the hardcore guys, the ones that have been in the scene active for a decade or longer, the veterans, so to say, of far-right extremism. They make money on the big platforms.
Yeah, Jessica, if I may, I'll just add one sentence. I mean, Alexander is the top expert on that, so he cracked it. I just say that, in the region that I look at, it's, I think they get lost in the sea of more patriotic merchandise, which is less toxic, and you can buy it, and it's easily available, and you have whole sections of the population actually brandishing certain clothes and logos and certain brands. Now, obviously, classifying this as far right or like extreme right and radical right, merchandise is obviously wrong and it would be tricky. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that they have strong competition. So if you have strong conservative forces in your country and a conservative government, which might not be sometimes very much appreciated by the European Commission, in this sense, actually, it does you good, because it kind of, neuters, kind of like, takes away quite a lot of the ammunition that the radical right would have in a society, for example, run, along more liberal or center-left lines. So that's the surprising finding, in a way, that it's good to have strong conservative political forces, because then, to some extent, the extremists are kind of like wondering, okay, so where do we go? How do we go about that? How do we fit into this picture? Of course, it has lots of negatives, and I'm not saying that this is all beautiful, but that also has an impact on the financing, or on the merchandise, and on the organization of such organizations and groups.